Welcome to The Stacks, a podcast about books and the people who read them. I'm your host, Tracy Thomas, and today we welcome staff writer at The Atlantic and New York Times bestselling author Adam Serwer to the podcast to discuss his new book, The Cruelty is the Point, The Past, Present, and Future of Trump's America. Our conversation covers a lot of ground, from the importance of the historical record to running as a part of Adam's creative process. Plus, you'll never guess who Adam's first writing teacher in college was. The Stacks Book Club pick for August is Emergency Contact by Mary H.K. Choi. We'll be discussing the book on the show on Wednesday, August 25th with Juliet Littman. If you love the Stacks and want to support the show, please consider joining the Stacks Pack. You earn perks like our monthly virtual book club and shout-outs on the show. Just know that without the Stacks Pack, there is no show. It's as simple as that, and I'm forever grateful to the folks who value my work enough to put their dollars behind it. If you want to join the Stacks Pack, head to patreon.com/thestacks. Thank you to our newest members of the Stacks Pack, Kate Bernstein, Sandra Bookhard, Jennifer Ross, Tracy Foster, Patricia White, Jessica Stone Weaver, Olivia Sears, Melissa Ramos, Julia Rumenap, and Bobby Joe DeBrune. I can't thank you all enough for your generosity and for allowing me to make a show that I love and am proud of. Okay, enough of all that sincerity. Let's talk with Adam Serwer. All right, everybody, I'm very excited. I'm here today with Adam Serwer, whose new book is called The Cruelty is the Point. It's a collection of essays over time, and it's really terrifying and fantastic. So, Adam, welcome to the Stacks.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that very kind introduction.
I don't know, do people describe your book as terrifying often?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm wonderful at parties. I'm just a barrel of laughs. Yeah, I mean, look, it's kind of grim. I mean, I think the last 5 years have been pretty grim. I mean, particularly in terms of what the country discovered about itself and what it was willing to accept and sustain. And I think that the nature of things is that public memory can be manipulated and altered to justify things that happened in the past that shouldn't be justified. And, the book is an attempt at, leaving a record. I mean, obviously it's from my perspective, it's my, assessment of those years. It's an attempt to leave a record of the past administration that, that in my view, will allow people to understand how bad it was, that people knew it was bad at the time, and that there was a constant effort to manipulate public memory not to understand how bad it was that was taking place even then, let alone, after the moment passed. And you can see this happen. I mean, you saw it happen. I think the first time you really see this is with Charlottesville, when the president says, they're very fine people on both sides, and one of the sides is a Klan rally.
Right.
People try to say, oh, well, he just meant the peaceful protesters who supported not removing the Lee statue. And it's like, well, those people weren't there. There were people who showed up because they understood it was a far right, alt-right KKK neo-Nazi rally. That's why David Duke was there. Right. And so, you sort of see it happening again with the Capitol riot, where people are now trying to say that, this, it was just tourists who got lost or something, or nobody was ever in any danger, or, American politics is often a fight over public memory. And so this is my attempt to, give, the country a record of the Trump years that I hope will be able to pierce through, the veil of that dishonesty, which I think is inevitable.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really stuck out to me in reading the book is what you mentioned kind of a little bit ago, which is there are people in the moment who are against the thing that is happening, right? Like, I think people often will be like, oh, everyone, my family was living in the South during the civil rights movement, and they, spat on Black people, but everybody was spitting on Black people. And it's like, wait a second. Like, no, there were white people who were fighting against this stuff too. And like, there were people who were actively talking about who weren't Martin Luther King. You know what I mean? Like there were people who were
Mm-hmm.
like everyday Americans, quote unquote, whatever that means, white people. And so I think like having what you've written in the moment is a reminder that we all, not we all, but many of us knew that it was wrong at the time. And I think that that is just so powerful to have. And I'm wondering why it was important for you to go back and write introductions to the essays. Because for folks who aren't familiar with the book yet, you should definitely get it. Each chapter has an introduction written by Adam in the present. And then there is the actual essay that was written for most of them in the past at the time that was published in The Atlantic, which is where Adam works. And so I'm wondering why it was important for you to kind of write these introductions in 2020 and 2021.
I think that it was important to look back in hindsight and like look at things that, you know, I may not have gotten quite right, or things, you know, the way that things may have changed, or the way that observations I made were actually substantiated by events. I mean, you know, I think that, you know, in some cases I was, you know, in some specific cases, I said things that people thought were extremely controversial or that they didn't like. In particular, I wrote about how the Trump administration's response to the coronavirus pandemic changed after the statistics showing tremendous racial disparities in coronavirus transmission were revealed. And at the time, people were like, "Well, why would Trump care about that? He's, you know, he's watching Fox News every day. He's not worried about that. He's, you know, people. This is what I used to call the incompetence defense, which is where people would imply that Trump was somehow did not have the mental faculty to understand the implications of something he said or did. And then, of course, you know, he came out and was like, "Well, you know, the deaths don't count if they're in blue states."
Right.
And of course, this is an absurd reductionism because. You know, Texas is a red state. There are millions of Democrats in Texas.
Right.
You know, there are millions and millions of Trump supporters in California, despite the fact that California is a blue state. So, you know, what he's saying is like, your life does not count if you, by association, live in a state that did not give Donald Trump his its electoral votes.
Right.
And that understanding of America, where he was president of a part of the country. The way that my colleague Ron Brownstein put it is, he's a wartime president for Red America at war with Blue America. That is just such a terrible thing for democracy, because it's when an elected representative feels as though they have no civic obligations to the people who did not vote for them. It means that they feel comfortable subjecting, not only ignoring their desires, but subjecting them to maltreatment, which is, of course, what happened. So I felt like it was important to reflect, you know, on things that I got right, on things that I may have been mistaken about. But also just to remember, you know, what we were thinking at the time when this was happening. And as you point out, there's this kind of defensive history where people say things like, you know, well, everybody thought that way at the time. And I think that's, you know, that defense often ignores what people really did think at the time. You know, I was reading a lecture by John Hope Franklin called "Racial Equality in America" that he gave in 1976, and he's talking about how Thomas Jefferson wanted to put an anti-slavery clause into the Declaration of Independence, and he thought that he could get this in by blaming the Crown for the slave trade, because that way he wouldn't antagonize tensions over slavery between North and South. You know, it didn't work. he didn't get it in. And then he continued to own people as slaves.
Right.
So, you know, it's not that he did not understand it was wrong. It was that he knew it was wrong and he went ahead anyway. When people say like someone is a person of their time, I mean, it's true that, you know, moral standards change, and they change in part because and in fact, the only reason they change is that people at the time, when supposedly nobody thinks something is wrong, think something is wrong and say, we need to change this.
Right.
So it's sort of it's an argument that kind of collapses in on itself.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And we see it in our lives. I think we just forget about it in the past. And so I think that's like what's so great. I mean,
Right.
you're a ridiculous, like your writing is so ridiculously incredible because you are writing about this current moment, right? Like in your work. I mean, we subscribe to The Atlantic. You're the third Atlantic writer I've had on the podcast this year, which truly is like the greatest thing that's ever happened to me because I'm such a super fan of The Atlantic. So just so you know, you're in great company.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no, thank you for agreeing. But what you do that's so incredible is that you find ways to talk about the current moment and bring history in as like a very much living part of the conversation. And I think that, you know, I'm seeing this in the book. I see it in your writing, and I feel like I understand why it's important, but I'm also curious, like, why is that context so important to you? Like, why do you put in that extra work to bring in these little tidbits about the historical figures that are connected to immigration in America? And what do you think we would lose without those pieces?
So, you know, one of my former editors at Mother Jones, he's a man named David Korn. And he said to me, many years ago, he said, the news is not just what's new, it's also what people have forgotten. And among journalists, the news is what's new is a sort of, it's an old-timey refrain that's meant to say, you know, to get something in the paper, you know, it has to be something that people did not previously know. Mm-hmm. But often readers don't have the context. Like if you're a beat reporter, you know everything on the subject that you write about. But readers often don't have that whole context. And there is a way in which journalism is very focused on the present. And so sometimes it can avoid the past or avoid relevant context. And the way I look at it is history is kind of like a map to where we are. And without that map, you can get really lost really quickly because you don't know how you got there. And so, for the past 5 years, you know, I was just sort of approaching this as, you know, a lot of us, I think, felt lost. Like, how do we go from Barack Obama to Donald Trump? And this book is kind of like a map. You know, it's drawing on the work of, you know, some brilliant historians who, you know, there's a big bibliography in the back of the book. There are too many recommendations to name. But you know, it's kind of a map. It's like, this is how we got here. And this is, you know, not necessarily where we're going, but these are the conditions that are going to continue to shape our future.
Because you have all this knowledge and you understand history and what's going on, when you're right, what is that like? Does that suck or does it feel good?
It's actually, I mean, it's often miserable to be right, given what I'm writing about.
Right. That's kind of what I was thinking.
You know, but like, one of the things is like, people are always, people have an assessment of my writing as pessimistic. But the flip side of like all these dark chapters in American history that I'm writing about that brought us to this point is that there are people on the other side who are fighting it.
Right.
And those people are inspirational to me. You know, those people are looking at the unjust world in which they live, and they are making a decision to try and make the future better for their children. And I find that tremendously admirable and inspirational. And I also always try to emphasize to people what we were and what made us what we are today does not necessarily define what we have to be later on. We can make different decisions. People can change. At the end of Reconstruction, you know, part of the reason why Reconstruction ended the way that it did was that, you know, there wasn't really like, even though there was a majority of white people wanted to abolish slavery, there wasn't really a majority of white people who wanted like real political equality for Black people. There was an ideological and partisan interest in extending the franchise to Black men during Reconstruction. But, you know, if you look at the radical Republicans, they're often like, oh, we don't mean social equality. We don't mean like, you know, your daughter is can marry one of these people. You know, and so this is like, obviously, you know, this actually changed fairly recently. Like, I think like a majority of Americans began to support interracial marriage, I believe in the 90s, which is like a statistical thing that I attribute to the Kevin Costner Whitney Houston film The Bodyguard.
Oh my God, yes.
But I'm joking, but only kind of because who knows, that might have really been it. But there's what's interesting about Trumpism to me is that it never commanded a majority. It was always reliant on the ideal geographic distribution of Republicans' political support across the Electoral College and across sparsely populated states. It was never a majority of the country that was on board with this. And you couldn't really say that in 1968 when Nixon got elected. Mm-hmm. That was a majoritarian, like a majority of the country was on board with the Southern strategy.
Right.
A majority of the country in 1877 did not think Black people should be equal to white people in like a social sense.
Isn't that scarier though, that like all that Trump and Trumpism was able to do, they were able to do without actually being the majority? Like, to me, that's like, if the majority of the people believe in this thing, then like we have to fight against that thing. But if the majority of the people don't even believe it and we still are like, they're still in power and they're still implementing all this, that to me is like, seems so much worse.
In some ways it's worse, right? Because, part of what this does is that system, which is reliant on the counter-majoritarian levers of American democracy to sustain itself, it is reliant on Trump's sort of politics of impending apocalypse, right? It becomes more and more urgent to persuade the base that you're relying on that they're on the verge of destruction at the hands of their fellow Americans. And so anything they do to prevent that destruction is justified. And that includes, as we're seeing now, attempts to disenfranchise or marginalize Democratic constituencies in the states, because they have convinced themselves they're the only true Americans. They're the only ones who are really entitled to run the country. And so, if liberals were allowed to hold power for any length of time, that would lead to the end of America. And as long as, that's a viable path structurally through our political system, the Republican Party is going to continue to pursue that kind of politics. And we know that's true because, as I talk about extensively in the book, that was how the Democratic Party used to be. Right. The Democratic Party was one of the oldest white supremacist institutions in American life. But then, there is this miracle, which is that a coalition of unions, urban liberals, and Black voters and Black activists, like, completely alter the nature of this organization that, was the party of slavery and secession and Jim Crow into the party of civil rights. So things, the country, like, in the same way that it would have been, very hard to predict in 2012 that Donald Trump was going to be the next president of the United States. We don't necessarily know that what Republicans are trying to do right now in terms of severing their power from the ability of the public to withdraw their support for that power. We don't know that that's going to work the way that they intend it to work. Life simply does not always proceed as you plan for it to. So in some sense, it is scary. It's certainly, it is anti-democratic in a way that perhaps in a different way than it was previously. Mm. And I don't really have a solution to the problem other than that the Democratic Party have to make structural changes to the system to make it more fair than it currently is. Right. And it doesn't appear as though they're willing to do that. But, I don't know that it's a worse situation than, the one that my parents were born into, for example. Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't mean to suggest that this is worse than Jim Crow or slavery or anything like that, but just the idea that like it's possible to do all this without the mandate from the people is just, it's very scary. Yeah, it's a different problem. You're right. It's a different problem. So the title essay, "The Cruelty is the Point," that was a huge essay when it came out. It's fantastic. And my big question around that is, does the opposite of the cruelty exist in the sense that there's some uniting force that people could feel good around that's like compassionate? Or do we just think that like it's always got to be a uniting force around like the worst of us? No, I mean, I think if you look at So I'll say one thing: democracy is a system for managing conflict. There's always going to be conflict in democracy. Democracy is the means to manage it nonviolently without bloodshed. And so, there's always going to be some level of conflict. I think that if you look at the Democratic Party today, it's a very broad coalition. Like, you have to unite hipsters in Greenpoint with church ladies in South Carolina.
Right.
And when you have to do that, you have to be respectful of many different types of people. Like, you can't, how like every Republican politician is like, he goes up and he gives a stump speech about, Starbucks lattes and NPR tote bags and like all these stupid stereotypes.
Right.
And you really can't do that if you're Joe Biden. Like, you can't be like, hey, cowboy, why don't you, support some gun regulations before you shoot yourself in the face? Like, you just can't, you can't disrespect people in that way, because your path to power relies on such a diverse, racial, religious, ideological coalition.
Right.
That, you have to persuade people rather than just, fire up the people who are like you. And I think, those types of coalitions, I mean, the Democratic Party is certainly not the first such coalition in American history. And I think, that kind of partnership, is not, I don't think that is rooted in cruelty. It's rooted in idealism. And, there are different examples of such coalitions in the book. But the point is, cruelty is certainly a tool for forming community, but it is not the only tool we have. And, you can see examples of how people from very different walks of life can come to see their interests as convergent, despite how different they are, and, build a politics on that kind of shared interest, and tolerance. And, it happens all the time. It's not just something that, it's not mythical. We actually do it. So I think, yes, I think the answer is yes. It's that I think what's striking about the Trump era is just how much he excelled at using cruelty as a tool for creating community, and was so unashamed of it in a way that I think, it's been a long time since we've seen a politician like that.
Yeah. And like the ways that he was able, as you point out, to make people feel good about themselves through, like villainizing other people. And I just found that to be, well, really depressing. And, and also like, it makes so much sense. Like one of the things that I appreciate about your book is that it makes so much sense. There was nothing in your book where I was like, no. Even when my initial impulse was to be like, wait, what? I was like, no, that actually makes a lot of sense. Like, it's just really like logical I don't know if that's because, I mean, I think it's because you're a great writer, but I also think it's because we probably are similarly aligned, and on a lot of our thinking and our perspective on the world, et cetera. But I found it to be like that argument that it was like that the cruelty is the thing. It just really clicked for me. And I'm wondering, when did that click for you? When did you realize like that was the thing that was happening?
The sort of depoliticized analogy I use to explain the title of the book is like, when you're a kid and there's like cool kids who are teasing another kid, and, maybe, you want to join in with the cool kids so you can be a cool kid too. Or maybe you just simply don't say anything because you don't want to be teased, or, there's a rare few of us who might actually stand up for that kid. But the point is that the kids who are doing the teasing are, this act of transgression and cruelty. They're forming community, in which the nerdy kid is on the outside. Now, some of us have experienced this personally. Some of us have been on one side of that or the other, but we all know it exists. We all know what that looks like. And this is just an elevation of that, to a political level. And so what I try to emphasize is that it's not, although Donald Trump was personally cool, and clearly enjoyed it, and to some extent, I don't think, I think Donald Trump and the people who are his worst critics are actually generally in agreement about what Donald Trump is about. I think it's the people who support Donald Trump and don't want to feel bad about what they're supporting who sort of had to tell themselves that it's about something different. Whereas he will simply say, I remember when he was, he was going after Colin Kaepernick, and he said, "Get that son of a bitch off the field."
Mm-hmm.
And he told, like the New York Times reported later that he told his advisors, he was like, "My people love this."
Right.
So he knows what he's doing. He's very aware. And it's sort of, there's this sort of conservative media industry whose job it was to launder those frank expressed thoughts into something that would be more palatable. But it is, it's a question of human nature. Like, we're all capable of enjoying someone else's misery, or, deliberately attempting to make another person miserable. The issue is that, we have a political system that incentivizes this type of politics, where, it's demonizing the people who are outside of this particular ideally geographically distributed population that supports the Republican Party, is a means to maintain power. And until that politics stops being rewarding, they're not going to stop engaging in it. They may not be as good at it or as effective as Trump. Trump brought in a lot of, low propensity voters into the system, in part because I think for some people, his nastiness was a symbol of a kind of incorruptibility.
Right.
He was unwilling to adhere to society's expectations of how a politician was supposed to speak, which meant that he was a person of integrity who, would stand up for the little guy against the big guy when he actually is the big guy.
Right.
And so, look, these are, the point of the book is not, that only Trump and Trump supporters are capable of this. It's that both Trump in particular and our system in general, Trump in particular was able to exploit this in part because of the way that our system has been constructed. And it's not something that is going to leave or disappear simply because, Trump is no longer president.
Right. Obviously, we've talked a lot about Trump because I think that's sort of like the framework of the book. However, there's a lot of essays in the book that are like more tangentially related to Trump. There's this incredible essay about Louis Farrakhan and the Women's March. And then there are some really great essays on immigration. And there's one on police unions. And I don't know, how do you know so much about so many things?
Okay, so the truth is that I spent a lot of time reading.
Yeah.
Like, it's just, when people ask me like how I come up with essays, the truth is that I am constantly reading stuff that I'm interested in. And that's how I find ideas for stories. Like, obviously, I go out and I report, I talk to people, I pick up the phone, but I'm not like the scoopiest reporter. What I've found is that my, the way I feel like I can be most informative is by uncovering things that are relevant to the present that people are not thinking about or not discussing. And the subjects that you mentioned, some of those are like personal to me. Like, I went to high school in Washington, D.C. And I knew Nation of Islam kids. I remember the day the Million Man March happened and my school was empty. And so, some of these are like related to my personal experiences. And some of them are simply like topics of interest, and things that, I wanted to write during the Trump years, but I could not because I simply didn't have, I didn't quite finish them, or get them. They weren't quite ready for prime time, or they weren't, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. It was just things that I felt really strongly about that I wanted to explore that I wasn't able to while he was in office. The essay on immigration, for example, which sort of traces Stephen Miller's family's immigration to the United States as a way to illuminate how drastically the American immigration system has changed over the past 100 years, was inspired, in fact, by 2016 when I was going to these Trump rallies and people would tell me, my family came the right way. Why can't these immigrants today come the right way? And that was fascinating to me because, of course, we had open borders for Europeans for most of the history of the United States.
Right.
And we developed this sort of militarized border, specifically to keep out migrants, migrants from Mexico and Latin America, because we wanted to be able to exploit their labor, but we didn't want them to come here and become citizens of the United States. And so, these were sort of just topics of fascination that I simply did not like. There were so many things to write about during the Trump era, which is sort of interesting because I do not think he as a person is that complicated or interesting. Like, I think his appetites are very clear.
Right.
His ideological predilections are very clear. There's only so much to say about his behavior.
Right.
I think what's more interesting is, why did we give this person power? And so, and what the book does is sort of, I'm looking at American history for answers to that question. Because I think it's an important question, because how, it also goes to, how do we move on from this now that it's over, or is it actually over?
Do you think you have an idea of how we move on from this now that it's over? / is it over?
I think that the ultimate meaning of the Trump era is one that the American people are writing right now. I don't think it's possible to say what that meaning is going to be. I think it really, a lot depends on, what happens in the next couple of years. But I do not think that it is. I don't think we know yet.
Are you optimistic?
I am neither optimistic nor pessimistic.
You're just mystic.
I think that I'm just mystic. Yeah. No, I just think I have been humbled so many times by trying to predict outcomes that I don't try to do it anymore. I just try to say, this is what's happened in the past in similar situations. And so this is, these are the events that are shaping our politics going forward. But I don't like to make predictions because, life will humble you. You just never know.
Yeah. So when you're, at home reading the news or watching the news or consuming the news, however you get it, you're just sitting there being like, this is interesting that this is happening. I wonder how this plays out. Or are you going both directions? Like, okay, this is worst case scenario. This is best case scenario. Like, how do you because you have to at some point come up with an opinion about these things to be able to then spend time writing them.
So I think there's for political writers, there's a tremendous incentive to focus on prediction. And the reason for that is that life is chaotic and uncertain. And we want the stability of feeling like we know what is going to happen next. Mm-hmm. The problem is that people are pretty bad at predicting things.
This is very true.
And if you look at even the tools we have for predicting things that are pretty good, recently they haven't been so good. Because of a partisan non-response in polling, it looked like Joe Biden was going to have an FDR victory over Donald Trump, but he did not. And he did not because the polling was not correct. And so, it is very tempting to try and say, well, this is going to happen or that's going to happen. But what I've found is that I can ground myself and I say, describe what is happening, not what's going to happen, but what is happening at this particular moment. And I find that, again, the past is very helpful with that because it's a map to the present. But I try, as much as people want you to say, here's what happens next, I've found that it is actually very hard to say what happens next, as much as people want you to do that.
Are there things that you look for or not to predict, but to kind of help you situate yourself in where we are now kind of things? Are there, votes in the Senate that are particularly guidepost-y or moments that you're like, okay, if this happens, I have a better sense of which way we're headed, or not even that for you?
Yeah. I mean, look, because, when things happen, events change. If the Democrats in the Senate suddenly decided, actually, we're going to admit DC and Puerto Rico as states, that immediately changes.
Right.
The playing field. On the other hand, if, the Democrats decide we're not going to do anything about all these voting laws being passed in the states, that also changes the playing field,
Right.
Or at least it tells you something about what outcomes could be. I think the challenge actually is to tell people what is happening in a way that they can understand it. And I think it's harder than people think it is. I think it's much easier. In some ways, it's much easier to write about the future because you can imagine whatever outcome you want.
Right.
And you're not necessarily bound by the strictures of the present. But but sometimes I think, and we saw this with Trump. I think early on, especially, people were trying to sort of mislead themselves about what they were seeing with their own eyes.
Right.
And so and that for various reasons. So I think the challenge remains seeing things as they are. I think it's more difficult than people think, and I think predicting the future is very tempting, but it's very hard not to fall into sort of evidence-free speculation.
Right. Are there any things that are not in this book that you wish were?
There was a piece I wrote on the Supreme Court, and its embrace of basically, so just to give a little context here, the end of Reconstruction came with blood and fire. Basically, the Democrats and their paramilitary allies overthrew the Reconstruction governments largely by intimidating and violently oppressing Black voters. But what happened after that was that there were all these Republican appointed justices on the Supreme Court whom you would expect to be sympathetic to the issue of Black rights. Instead, they basically slowly wrote the Civil War amendments out of the Constitution. And I wrote this piece in 2018 when Kennedy was stepping down, saying, look, the current conservative majority on the Supreme Court has a similarly narrow view of the Reconstruction amendments, to where they are not going to defend Americans' rights to due process and anti-discrimination, because they think these are unjustifiable interferences by the federal government into the prerogatives of the states or into people's individual rights to discriminate. And that piece didn't end up in the book, in part because I was unsure about whether it ended up, being accurate. But I think when you look at the most recent ruling on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is basically the most spurious concerns of fraud justify ignoring the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees the right to vote free from discrimination on the basis of race. I think I sort of wish that essay was in there now. But, at the time I was sort of unsure about whether my assessment had actually been correct, in part because of some unusual rulings from the Supreme Court. And this is honestly, this is a smokescreen that always happens. This is what the Roberts Court has done for years. They've always hidden extremely right-wing rulings in the occasional socially liberal ruling. So, they'll strike down DOMA, but they'll also gut Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. That's a very consistent strategy that Roberts has had. And I sort of regret allowing it to snow me about what I was actually saying at the time, because I feel like it definitely played out as I said.
That's really interesting. I'm obsessed with people talking about the Supreme Court, because I just don't feel that I'm smart enough to fully understand what's going on over there with those guys and gals. But so maybe your next book could be about the Supreme Court for me.
People overcomplicate it. I'll be honest with you. People overcomplicate it. First of all, I used to cover the Supreme Court for a couple of years. I did it for Mother Jones and I did it for MSNBC. And I really enjoy covering it because it's like the closest thing we have to like a wizard's conclave in like a fantasy novel. You know what I mean? Where it's like you have like the judges in their robes and they do their weird legal incantations, and you have to sort of predict or analyze what their what the ruling will be, what their reasoning will be, what arguments are going to appeal to them. It's like so much more art than science. Right. And there's so much formality and ritual to the Supreme Court. Like when you're in there and like you hear the guy call, "Oh yay!"
Yeah.
It's just like there's so much. There's something. It's like very.
It's like mystical.
I'm trying to think of the word. Right. It's very mystical. It's very like, there's a kind of, I'm sorry for making a Harry Potter reference, but there's like a Hogwarts-ishness to it.
I don't know
To
Harry
me,
Potter.
like,
This is my one failing
I have
or slash
actually
not
never
failing.
read those
Me
books.
neither. I've never
I've
even seen the
never read those
movies.
books,
And now I probably
but I
never
just mean the
will.
trappings of
Right.
like, wizards and robes type shit.
Yeah. I feel you.
That's what it's like. And I enjoyed it. It was really interesting. I got to cover a lot of interesting cases. And it's much less complicated than people think it is. The truth is that these guys come up with what lawyers really like doing is coming up with elaborate, complicated explanations for things that a regular person could actually summarize and explain very easily. But because they're lawyers and they're sort of taught to think in labyrinths, this is, whatever they come up with is always overly complicated. Which in turn inspires interpretations of the law that can be really strange and creative in order for, someone to get the thing that they wanted that the law probably says that they can't get. And, a lot of it just simply depends on, how many of the justices you can convince to take your side. And when you're a conservative attorney and there are 6 Republican appointed justices on the Supreme Court, you're going to get your way most of the time.
Right. There was a really good Supreme Court podcast from NPR, More Perfect, I think is what it was called. And it was really great. And I loved it because they talked about like older rulings and like kind of helped explain how they shape things. Like they did like Dred Scott, but they also did Korematsu. And like, anyways, it was really great. And I loved it. And I feel like someone needs to do a podcast about the Supreme Court called like, there's a ruling for that. And they like go through the rulings and like explain what the fuck they mean, because I love learning about it. I just never can understand the like when they put out their little opinions and their little dissents or whatever. I'm like, I don't know where we are here.
It's pretty fascinating. The issue I think with the Supreme Court is that sort of dynamic that I'm talking about, where there's like a big landmark ruling that seems very socially liberal, hiding, a history of reactionary rulings. And I think that this is like sort of America's relationship to the Supreme Court in general, is everybody thinks about Brown, or they think about the Warren Court, and they think that the court has historically been this progressive force in American history, when it's actually one of the most reactionary institutions in American history. It almost always sides with the powerful and the wealthy. And I mean in a historical sense. I don't just mean the Roberts Court.
Right.
And it has this extensive record, and it's sort of hidden by, things like Brown, or, striking down DOMA, or legalizing same-sex marriage. These kinds of like, huge progressive landmarks are, very few and far between.
And I feel like that sort of speaks what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, which is like that the history writes a version of, or like history can write a version of what happened that isn't actually true. Like that we
power
think
justifies itself.
Yeah, exactly. And like that there weren't all these other horrible rulings that were harmful to everyday humans as opposed to the rich and powerful. Valentine's Day is upon us, and I've got love on the brain. Love for books, duh, of course. Hello. Did you forget what podcast you're listening to? I love bringing you all great reads, exclusive author interviews, and behind the scenes book gossip. But I can only do that with your support over on Patreon and Substack. Our Stacks Patreon community, also known as the Stacks Pack, is where you can go for book club meetups, a private, very active Discord, and a year-long mega reading challenge to help you achieve all your reading goals. Plus, you also get that monthly bonus episode. Now, over on the Substack, you can subscribe to my newsletter, Unstacked, where I keep the book conversations going. I also give you a healthy dose of sports and pop culture, definitely some hot takes happening over there. And again, that bonus episode. If you don't have a few dollars to spare, don't worry. There are free options on the Substack and the Patreon to get you a little extra Stacks magic. Making this podcast is a total team effort, and by supporting my Patreon and my Substack, you allow me to support my amazing team that makes the show possible every single week. So if you or your friends are looking to meet other book lovers and support this indie podcast, come hang out with me on Patreon, Substack, or both. I would love to have you. And since we're talking about love, you can gift subscriptions to the Patreon and the Substack for that special reader in your life. For the Stacks Pack, head to patreon.com/thestacks. And for the newsletter, head to traceythomas.substack.com. And also, there are links to both in the show notes. Okay, see you in the stacks. I'm going to totally transition to your process in writing.
Sure.
I want to know sort of how you wrote this book. Like, I know obviously you wrote many of the essays over time in different parts of your life, but sort of how do you write? Where are you? How many hours a day? Do you listen to music? Do you light a candle? Do you have snacks and beverages? Like, what is Adam's writing vibe?
This is going to sound totally insane.
I can't wait. Everyone has a different answer, and it's literally everyone thinks their answer is the weirdest one, and everyone's is the same but different.
Your listeners are going to be like, Adam has an eating disorder, and he needs to. So basically, a few years ago, I started doing intermittent fasting, and I started doing it like once a day, where I'd like fast until dinner time, once a day, once a week, and then eventually it just like expanded to the rest of the week.
Okay. You're my husband, I think. My husband does not eat ever. It's drives me crazy.
But here's the thing. I eat. I just don't eat until 6. But I eat. Whatever I want. It's glorious. It's wonderful. But in that period of time, particularly in the morning, I only drink water and coffee. And the reason for this is what I found was that I have a lot more energy when I don't eat during the day. I used to like strictly plan my meals where I'd have breakfast, I'd have like an egg sandwich, and then I'd have like a salad for lunch. And then, but what happened is like every time I ate, I would be tired and I'd spend like 10 minutes or, 30 minutes like messing around on the internet or something.
Right.
And I find that I'm much more focused when I'm fasting, which is going to again, everybody's going to think I'm a crazy person. The other thing is that I have to run every day.
Okay.
It is
how
like
close do you run
of
to your eating? Because this was my problem with intermittent fasting.
I think that it is much easier to run in the morning when you are still like you have like the dinner from the night before in your system.
Got it.
If you wait until the end of the day, you are going to be like, I think technically it's better for you because you're burning your reserve energy, but it sucks.
Okay.
But what I found is that the adrenaline helps me organize my thoughts for writing. And particularly in the morning is when I have my best, the morning is my best writing time. I can write at night. I can write until like really early in the morning if I need to. But as I get older, that aspect of it used to be like when I was in college, there was like when you slept, when you ate, and when you worked, and it didn't have any relationship to day or night.
Okay.
But I can't do that anymore. It really fucks me up if I try to work, late into the night. So I find like my best hours are in the morning, and my best writing is done post run.
And you run 7 days a week?
This is going to sound insane. I run 8 miles a day, 4 days a week.
Wow.
And then on 2 of my off days, I run 3.5 miles. And then on Sunday, I don't run at all.
Okay. I used to be a runner. I have a lot of running questions now, and I don't want to get too personal. How long does it take you to run those 8 miles?
It takes me exactly 1 hour and 4 minutes.
Wow. Exactly. Every time. You're just like Mr.
Every
Consistency.
time.
I'm obsessed with this for you. I love this. Okay. Have you ever done like the whole marathon thing? Did you ever do that?
No, I have never been in a race.
Ever.
So this is a little more personal than I probably should get, but
please do. This is a podcast. That is what podcasts are for.
Here is the thing about me. Like my like insane like discipline with exercise stems from high school.
Okay.
When I was like a chubby kid and I used to get picked on and I used to get in a lot of fights. And at about the age of 16, 17, I started running and I lost a ton of weight. And something that I noticed is that people treat fat people very, very differently.
Yes.
And I know that because I was fat and then I lost weight. And in my mind, I'm still like, despite the fact that I'm 40 years old and I haven't been overweight in a very long time, that like mindset is still in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's sort of like, in a weird way, I mean, it's like force of habit, but it's also just the knowledge. Like part of it is motivated by the knowledge that people really do treat you differently if you if you are physically different. It's sort of absurd, but it's just the way it is.
Okay. And why no racing? You just never wanted to. You never
Oh,
thought like,
I
oh,
just have
I
no.
want to
It
do
is
it.
entirely it is entirely a health thing for me. I have no
Okay.
desire to be competitive
Oh,
with exercising.
are you competitive?
Am I competitive in general?
Yeah.
Yes, but
That's
with exercising, I have no, I have no motivation for it because I can't really explain it. I just don't care.
okay. That's fair.
It's I feel like people are always telling me like I should race because it's fun, and I can imagine it being fun, but in a weird way, I don't do it because it would break my routine.
Mm,
And I'm like very much married to that routine.
that's fair. I used to run and I used to do races because it was the only way that I would run was like to be working towards something. But I've since long stopped running. Not long stopped. I ran a few weeks ago, but it doesn't do the same thing for me as it used to. I don't know. Anyways.
I mean, I just like if it did not. I think if it. I mean, I think there's two things. Is one, it's sort of like that. As I said earlier, that sort of memory of being that kid that motivates me. But it's also just that it's such an important part of my writing process in
Right.
terms of like getting my brain to start, like the wheels in my brain to start turning. Like I think of some of my best lines when I'm running and I'm lost in an adrenaline haze because my body is trying to get itself to keep going.
Mm,
And I think I would probably be a worse writer if I didn't have that.
that's fair. I'm curious about when you revisited your work for the book, were you hypercritical of yourself? An attribute of yourself that exists, or were you sort of pleasantly surprised or disappointed in anything, like going back and rereading your work to kind of bring it back into the world? And then on top of that, I know that one of your teachers in your life was Kiese Layman, and I know he's like Mr. Revision. So I'm wondering if you did do revision on any of the
I
essays.
love Kiese so much.
I do too.
I probably wouldn't be a writer without Kiese.
He's the greatest human.
I met Kiese when I was 19 years old, and I walked into my first college classroom, and he was teaching his first college class, which is a class called Literature from the Underground, where we had to we were reading like Tolstoy and Jay-Z, which is like that is literally how Kiese Layman teaches classes.
A dream.
And he was just he's an interesting teacher because he is not. You know how some teachers will just like tell you you're wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? Kiese will ask you questions to lead you to the conclusion that he knows you have yet
That you're wrong.
at, that is going to, well, not necessarily that you're wrong, but that you've done something or you have not entirely thought through something that you said or written,
Right.
or why you said or wrote it. And it's not so much that you're wrong, but he wants you to understand why you did that and whether or not that was actually what you wanted to do. And so he's just like an extraordinary teacher. And I feel very fortunate to have had him as a professor, and also just as a friend. Like, Kiese was I don't know how much he talked to you about this, but he was basically like an informal therapist for all the students of color at Vassar for years.
Yeah.
He was taking on, and this is pretty common, I think, but this is he was taking on burdens far beyond the classes he was teaching,
Right.
because these are environments that can sometimes be very unwelcoming to students of color, and he was very much there to support people. His office door was always open. In fact, he probably let us in to talk to him more than he should have. But he was just an extremely generous soul, and still is. But in terms of like writing and being hypercritical, look, I don't want to get too much into my own headspace, but I think that writers are extraordinarily self-critical. I think it's like a necessary sort of, I don't mean this in a literal Darwinian way, but a sort of necessary evolutionary part of the process is you have to be able to be self-critical to have an internal mental process that is capable of producing writing. And if you don't, I think that can lead you to a bad place in terms of not being as, I mean, particularly if you're writing polemics, you have to be able to anticipate counter arguments, not just because, you know, of what people might say to you, but because your argument will not be strong if you are not considering the strongest opposition to that argument. Something that Ta-Nehisi Coates, he came to speak to a group of reporters I was with at one point, and he said, you know, one thing that I like to do is I like to take the strongest version of the opposing argument and I like to beat it to pieces. Not the weakest version, not the one you can most easily make fun of or most easily mock or get everybody to laugh at, but the strongest one. And that's what makes for a compelling piece.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, this is, maybe this is too personal, I don't know, but what is a word you can never spell correctly on the first try?
I don't think that's that personal.
No, I was just kidding. I'm just giving you a hard time. I'm giving you a hard time.
I don't know.
Are you a great speller?
I'm sure there is one. I'm not a good speller. I'm not a good speller, but the thing about phones is that they have eliminated the need to be a good speller because they autocorrect.
Yeah, no, it's true.
So, I mean, let me just put it this way. Actually, I will use the phone thing to tell you a word that I never spell correctly. And I'll just say that word is definitely not duck.
Okay. It's like the phone really thinks everyone's obsessed with ducks. Like, give me a break, iPhone.
No, I'm not trying to say duck. That's not what I'm trying to say.
I'm not doing that. That's so funny. Okay, I have just two more questions for you. One is for people who love this book, and I know that you're going to have a lot of answers, but you can try to narrow it down for me. For people who love this book, what are a few books you would recommend that are sort of in conversation with the work that you've done?
I would highly recommend How the Word Is Passed by Clint Smith, my colleague, which is very much about how power maintains a self-serving kind of public memory. I think that Nell Irvin Painter's The History of White People is one of the most important books that I've ever read in my life. It's a history of the concept of race. And, you know, as Ta-Nehisi says, you know, race is the child of racism, not the father. And this is an important book for documenting that whole process. I think that, you know, Black Reconstruction in America is one of my favorite books. I think it's hard to understand America if you have not read that book. If you've never read Paula Giddings' Ida, A Sword Among Lions, this is an extraordinary book because it's a biography of Ida Wells, but there's so much tea in it. Like it is like very much a book that is also about the social, like this kind of social scene of Black intellectuals at, like, you know, the nadir of race relations in the United States. All these people who like kind of don't like each other, or like people who do like each other, people who are on the same side of arguments, people who are completely ideologically opposed, but for some reason have some kind of alliance. Like, it is just a really fascinating book that is not just a wonderful history of Ida Wells's life, but it's sort of an extraordinary portrait of Black American intellectuals at the time. So it's just a really lovely book.
Okay. Those are great recommendations. Okay. My last question for you is, if you could have one person, dead or alive, read your book, who would you want it to be?
Wow, that is so mortifying. What a question. I don't even know how to answer that. I would be so embarrassed if, like, W.B. Du Bois like woke up and read my book. I would be like, please don't read my book.
Okay, well, maybe it's not him. Maybe it's someone else that you're not embarrassed to share your work with.
I mean, like, because you think about, like, all, like, obviously the answer is, like, you would want somebody who you admire to read your book, but then it's terrifying because what if they don't like it?
That's true. That's true.
Anyway,
you're pleading the fifth. It's okay.
This question has given me an existential panic, so I'm not going to answer it. However, I will say that it's a lovely question. I think you should keep answering it, and maybe other people will not react with similar levels of anxiety.
Let me just tell you, I've been doing this podcast now for 3.5 years, and you are the first person to ever not answer it because of anxiety.
It's so terrifying. What a terrifying question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't want to end on a terrifying note, but unfortunately our time here has come to an end. I'm going to send you on your way to just be stressed out. I'm so sorry. This was not my plan for you.
This was great. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
This was so great. Thank you so much. And everyone, you can find The Cruelty is the Point wherever you get your books. It's out now. And you can also subscribe to The Atlantic, where Adam writes along with Clint and Van, who we all heard earlier this year on the show. It's like you guys are like the Rushmore.
I love those guys.
I mean, so great. It's like
the
genius.
Atlantic has like become this like quiet, like is quietly like recruited this murderer's row of like Black writers, and I just love it.
It's so great, and I love it too.
It's not like it's like, you know, at one time I think, you know, Ta-Nehisi was very much identified with the magazine, but now there's no one Black writer you can identify with the Atlantic because there are so many of us, and it's a beautiful thing. It's
so great. So yes, subscribe to the Atlantic, get the book. Adam, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And everyone else, we will see you in the stacks. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Adam Serwer for being my guest. Also, a huge thank you to Rachel Parker, Shauna Carlos, and Melanie DiNardo for working to make this episode happen. Our August book club pick is Emergency Contact by Mary H.K. Choi, which we will discuss on the show on Wednesday, August 25th with Juliet Littman. If you like what you hear, consider supporting The Stacks by becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/thestacks. Please make sure you're subscribed to The Stacks wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're listening through Apple Podcasts, be sure to leave us a rating and a review. For more from The Stacks, follow us on social media at The Stacks Pod on Instagram, at The Stacks Pod _ on Twitter, and check out our website, thestackspodcast.com. Sebastian Alcala is our sound editor and producer. Our graphic designer is Robin McCrite, and our theme music is from Tigirigis. The Stacks is created and produced by me, Tracy Thomas.